Picture this. Over the last 72 hours, Washington has been jolted awake. Judges removed at unprecedented scale. Federal agencies ordered to hand over hidden data. SNAP fraud, Somali link fraud, welfare abuse, immigration failures, all suddenly dragged into the sunlight. And behind it all, a president making one sweeping move after another, moves that critics are calling extreme, but supporters describe as long overdue corrections to a system that has quietly failed for decades. But here's the twist no one saw coming. These actions aren't isolated. They're coordinated. They're strategic. And they're aimed at reshaping the most powerful levers inside the federal government, the courts, the agencies, the data systems, and even Congress's own oversight powers. Today, we're going to break down exactly what Trump has done, how these decisions fit together, and why political insiders say this may be his most aggressive power play yet. By the end of today's video, you'll understand why this moment is bigger than judges, bigger than fraud cases, and bigger than partisan drama. This is a restructuring of the system itself. Now, before we dive into the dramatic headlines, the firings, the lawsuits, the threats, we need to understand something crucial. None of this came out of nowhere. For years, millions of Americans have watched as our immigration system became paralyzed. Court cases stacked up like unread mail. Welfare programs hemorrhaged money to people who shouldn't qualify. And our borders? Well, they became more like suggestions than actual boundaries. Think about it this way. Imagine you own a house and you notice water damage in the ceiling. At first, it's just a small stain. You ignore it. Then it spreads. You patch it. But the problem isn't the ceiling, it's the pipes behind the walls. Eventually, you realize you can keep patching, or you can replace the pipes. That's where America found itself. The system wasn't just leaking anymore. It was broken at the foundation. For decades, immigration courts moved at a glacial pace. People would enter the country illegally, get a court date, and that date might be 3, 4, even 10 years away. During that time, they'd work, have children, establish roots, all while technically waiting for a hearing that might never come. The backlog grew so massive that some cases scheduled today won't be heard until the next decade. Let that sink in. We're talking about a system where justice delayed isn't just denied, it's abandoned entirely. And it wasn't just incompetence. For some officials, this gridlock was the goal. Why? Because a system that never decides is a system that never deports. It became a quiet form of permanent residency by bureaucratic exhaustion. Meanwhile, American citizens footed the bill not just financially, but socially, culturally, and in terms of security. Trump's administration didn't stumble into these recent actions. They've been methodically gathering evidence, filing data requests, building legal cases, and preparing for a sweeping overhaul. This wasn't impulsive. This was calculated. And that brings us to the first shockwave Washington didn't see coming. Over the span of just a few weeks, more than 100 immigration judges were terminated, not reassigned, not reprimanded, fired. In New York City alone, over a dozen judges received termination notices. In San Francisco, the number was even higher. Entire courthouses saw a quarter or more of their judicial staff removed in a single sweep. This wasn't trimming around the edges. This was a full-scale purge. Now, you might be thinking, can a president really do that? Aren't judges supposed to be independent? Well, here's the crucial distinction. We're not talking about federal judges, the kind appointed for life under Article 3 of the Constitution. Those judges are insulated from political pressure by design. But immigration judges? They're different. They work for the Executive Office for Immigration Review, which falls under the Department of Justice. And the Department of Justice reports directly to the president. So yes, legally, the president has the authority to remove these officials. They're part of the executive branch, not the judiciary. But legality and precedent are two different things. Never before has a president fired immigration judges at this scale or this speed. The move sent shockwaves through the legal community, and the reaction was immediate. Activist groups called it authoritarian. Legal scholars debated its constitutionality. News outlets ran headlines calling it a massacre. But here's what they often left out of the story: why these judges were targeted in the first place. An investigation, and not from some partisan outlet, but from a fairly neutral source, found that many of the terminated judges had extraordinarily high asylum approval rates. We're talking about judges who approved asylum claims at rates far above the national average, sometimes granting relief in cases where the legal standard clearly wasn't met. One judge in Manhattan, for instance, approved asylum more often than any other judge in the entire courthouse. Another had a backlog so severe that cases under their docket were being scheduled into the late part of the next decade. Now, let's be fair. Not every judge was removed for being too lenient. Some simply couldn't keep up with their caseloads. Others had procedural issues or ethical complaints. But the pattern was unmistakable. Judges who treated immigration court as a venue for advocacy rather than enforcement were the first to go. And when you're sitting on a backlog of nearly 4 million cases, yes, you heard that right, nearly 4 million, speed and consistency matter. Justice delayed is justice denied, as the saying goes. And for American citizens watching their tax dollars fund this endless cycle of hearings and appeals, their frustration had reached a boiling point. So the administration acted. They didn't ask permission. They didn't form a committee to study the issue for 2 years. They identified the problem, exercised their legal authority, and made the cuts. Was it ruthless? Absolutely. Was it legal? According to the Constitution, yes. Was it necessary? That depends on whether you think a system collapsing under its own weight deserves a structural overhaul or just another Band-Aid. But firing judges was only step one. Step two is what really sent shockwaves through the legal world. Here's where things get even more interesting. The administration didn't just remove judges. They started hiring new ones, and they're calling them something different. Not immigration judges. Deportation judges. Now, that might sound like a semantic game, but words matter. And in this case, the name signals a fundamental shift in mission. The Department of Homeland Security recently posted job openings for these positions, offering salaries upwards of $200,000 a year, with the possibility of remote work. On paper, it sounds like a cushy government job, but look closer at the qualifications they're seeking. Backgrounds in immigration enforcement, military service, federal law enforcement. Notably absent? Experience in immigration defense or advocacy work. A major newspaper reviewed the backgrounds of around a dozen newly appointed judges and found that not a single one had ever worked defending immigrants in court. Not one. Every single appointee came from enforcement backgrounds: ICE, Border Patrol, military JAG offices, or federal prosecution. If you were designing a judicial system meant to process cases quickly and prioritize deportations, this is exactly how you do it. Now, left-wing activists and immigrant rights groups are sounding the alarm. They argue that a judiciary staffed entirely by former enforcers can't be impartial. They worry that hearings will become rubber stamps for deportation rather than fair assessments of asylum claims. And they're not wrong to be concerned bias can run both ways. A judge who spent 20 years as an ICE prosecutor might view cases through a very different lens than one who spent 20 years helping asylum seekers. But here's the counterargument, and it's one that resonates with a lot of Americans, especially those who've watched the system fail for decades. The old approach wasn't working. When your immigration courts have a backlog measured in millions, when cases take years to resolve, when judges approve asylum claims that later turn out to be fraudulent, something has to change. You can't keep doing the same thing and expect different results. That's not justice. That's institutional paralysis. So the administration made a choice. They're prioritizing speed and enforcement over prolonged deliberation. They're hiring judges who understand the law from the perspective of protecting borders, not from the perspective of finding creative ways to let people stay. Is that fair? Is that just? Those are hard questions. Some will say yes, others will say no. But one thing is undeniable. The system is being fundamentally reshaped, and it's happening faster than anyone expected. And this wasn't just about judges and courts. The next move hit at the finances, the lifeblood of political power. Let's talk about SNAP. That's the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, formerly known as food stamps. It's one of the largest federal welfare programs in the country, serving more than 40 million Americans. It's also, according to recent investigations, riddled with fraud. Here's what happened. The administration, through the Department of Agriculture, requested detailed records from all 50 states about who's receiving SNAP benefits. Not just aggregate numbers, they wanted names, addresses, social security numbers, benefit amounts, and immigration status. Why? Because they suspected massive fraud. People receiving benefits in multiple states, deceased individuals still getting checks, non-citizens illegally enrolled in the program. Now, you'd think that if states are administering a federal program with federal dollars, they'd have no problem handing over that data, right? Well, here's where it gets messy. Around half the states complied, mostly red states, but more than 20 states, nearly all of them blue, refused. California, New York, Minnesota, and others essentially told the federal government, no, you can't have that information. Their reasoning? Privacy concerns. They argued that the administration's request was unprecedented, invasive, and went far beyond normal oversight. They worried the data would be used not to fight fraud, but to target immigrant communities and create fear. Advocacy groups echoed these concerns, calling it a thinly veiled attempt at intimidation. But the administration didn't back down. Instead, they issued an ultimatum. Hand over the data, or we'll freeze your SNAP funding. No compliance, no money. It was a hardball tactic, and it immediately triggered lawsuits. Democratic governors accused the administration of weaponizing welfare programs. Legal scholars debated whether the federal government even had the authority to withhold mandatory funding. Courts issued conflicting rulings. Some said the freeze was legal, others said it wasn't. And here's where it gets really interesting watching all this unfold. This isn't really about SNAP. It's about control. It's about whether the federal government can enforce accountability in programs it funds. If states can simply refuse to provide data, then federal oversight becomes meaningless. You're essentially running a trillion-dollar system on the honor code. Now, think about your own life for a moment. If you've ever applied for Social Security, Medicare, or any government benefit, you know they ask for everything. Your employment history, your tax records, your medical information. They verify it all. Why? Because they need to make sure you're eligible and that taxpayer money is being spent properly. That's just common sense. So why should SNAP be any different? The administration's argument is simple. If taxpayer money is being spent, the government has a right and a responsibility to know where it's going. If someone is double-dipping, collecting benefits in 3 states under different names, that's fraud. If deceased people are still on the rolls, that's waste. If non-citizens who aren't legally eligible are receiving benefits, that's abuse. And if states won't help root it out, then maybe they shouldn't be administering the program in the first place. Critics counter that the real goal isn't fighting fraud, it's creating a chilling effect. Make immigrants afraid to apply for benefits, even if they're legally entitled. Use data requests as a backdoor form of immigration enforcement. Turn welfare offices into ICE recruiting stations. But here's the problem. Fraud is real. The scale might be debated, but the existence isn't. And when the federal government asks for basic accountability measures and states refuse, it raises an obvious question. What are they hiding? And that question becomes even more pointed when you look at what's been uncovered in places like Minnesota, where the fraud wasn't just theoretical, it was staggering. Minnesota became ground zero for one of the most explosive fraud scandals in recent memory. We're talking about $1 billion problem that went unaddressed for years, and it centered largely around organizations within the Somali community. Now, before anyone accuses me of bias or targeting, let me be crystal clear. This isn't about ethnicity or religion. I'm just the messenger, and this is about accountability. When fraud happens, it needs to be called out, regardless of who's committing it. Here's what investigators found. Numerous organizations in Minnesota, many run by or serving Somali immigrants, were systematically defrauding federal programs. We're talking about child care fraud, where fake daycares claimed reimbursements for children who didn't exist. We're talking about SNAP fraud, where benefits were sold for cash at discounted rates. We're talking about housing assistance fraud, tax fraud, identity fraud, the list goes on. And the scale? Estimates range from hundreds of millions to over $1 billion. Now, when this came to light, the reaction was swift and divided. President Trump held a press conference where he didn't mince words. He called out Minnesota's leadership for allowing this to happen. He specifically mentioned Representative Ilhan Omar, suggesting that she and her colleagues had turned a blind eye because many of the fraudsters were part of their political base. He even made the statement that she shouldn't be allowed to serve in Congress and should be thrown out of the country. That language provoked outrage. Community leaders in Minneapolis compared the targeting of Somali communities to 1932's Germany. They argued that asking people to carry documentation proving citizenship was reminiscent of authoritarian regimes. They accused the administration of xenophobia, of scapegoating vulnerable immigrants, of using isolated cases of fraud to justify broad crackdowns on entire communities. And look, those concerns aren't baseless. History is full of examples where governments use legitimate problems as pretexts for discrimination. So we need to be vigilant. We need to make sure that fighting fraud doesn't become an excuse for targeting people based on their background. But here's the other side of the coin. When state officials were warned about this fraud years ago, and they were, according to multiple reports, they did essentially nothing. Hundreds of state employees flagged suspicious activity, whistleblowers came forward, audits revealed patterns, and yet the political will to investigate and prosecute simply wasn't there. Why? Because it was politically inconvenient, because it might alienate a voting bloc, because calling out fraud in immigrant communities, even when it's real, opens you up to accusations of bigotry. So the fraud continued. The vast majority who follow the rules, work hard, and contribute to their communities got tarred with the same brush. That's the real tragedy here. When a system tolerates fraud because prosecuting it is uncomfortable, everyone loses. The taxpayers lose. The legitimate recipients lose, and the integrity of the programs themselves erodes. Trump's rhetoric was harsh, but the underlying point was hard to dismiss. Accountability matters. If we allow certain communities to be exempt from scrutiny because we're afraid of being called names, we're not being compassionate, we're being negligent, and that negligence has consequences measured in billions of dollars. But here's the thing, this wasn't unique to Minnesota. As investigators started pulling threads, they found fraud everywhere Washington looked. Let's zoom out for a moment and look at the bigger picture. SNAP fraud in blue states, Somali fraud in Minnesota, but that's just the beginning. Investigators found rampant abuse in the Small Business Administration, particularly in pandemic relief programs. Remember those paycheck protection loans? Billions of dollars went to businesses that didn't exist, to applicants who lied about their employee counts, to people who spent the money on luxury cars and vacations instead of payroll. Then there's Social Security. People collecting benefits while living abroad, sometimes in countries we don't even have diplomatic relations with. Deceased individuals whose families kept cashing checks for years. Disability claims approved based on fraudulent medical records. And immigration? Oh, that's a whole other level. People entering the country under false pretenses, claiming asylum based on fabricated stories, disappearing into the interior before their court dates. Multiple identities, multiple benefit claims, multiple states all at the same time. Now, here's what ties all of this together. It's not that fraud is new. Fraud has always existed. But what's different now is the scale, and more importantly, the lack of verification systems to catch it. Our government databases don't talk to each other. A person can apply for benefits in California, get approved, then apply again in New York under a slightly different name, and the systems won't flag it. We've built a bureaucracy so vast and so disconnected that it's almost designed to be defrauded. Think about it like this. Imagine you run a bank, and you don't check whether people applying for loans actually exist. You don't verify their income. You don't cross-reference their applications. You just hand out money based on what they write on a form. How long would that bank stay in business? About 5 minutes, right? Yet that's essentially how we've been running federal programs for decades. And here's the kicker. It's not entirely accidental. For some politicians, a bloated, inefficient system is a feature, not a bug. Because the more people who depend on government assistance, even fraudulently, the more voters you have with a stake in keeping the system exactly as it is. It's a form of political insurance. You're not just buying votes with taxpayer money. You're buying future votes by making sure the system is too broken to fix. That might sound cynical, but look at the resistance to reform. Every time someone proposes tightening eligibility requirements, the response is immediate and fierce. You're trying to starve children. You're attacking the vulnerable. You're cruel and heartless. Never mind that the requirements are meant to ensure that only eligible people receive benefits. Never mind that every dollar spent fraudulently is a dollar not available for someone who genuinely needs it. Which leads us to one of the most controversial moves yet. While all of this was unfolding, the judge firings, the snap data battles, the fraud investigations, Trump started making noises about something even bigger, reshaping executive power itself. He began openly calling for the elimination of the filibuster in the Senate. He suggested that immigration judges should have even less independence, that deportation decisions should be streamlined to the point of being almost automatic. He argued that the executive branch needs more authority, not less, because Congress has proven incapable of acting. Now, this is where even some of Trump's supporters start to get uncomfortable. The filibuster, for all its flaws, is a tool that forces compromise. It prevents the party in power from ramming through whatever it wants without at least some bipartisan support. Eliminating it might help Republicans today, but what about tomorrow, when Democrats regain power? Do we really want to hand them that same unchecked authority? Trump's argument is straightforward. Democrats have already made it clear they'll eliminate the filibuster the moment it's convenient. Prominent Democratic senators openly discussed it during the previous administration. They wanted to pack the Supreme Court, eliminate the filibuster, grant statehood to D.C., and Puerto Rico, all to lock in permanent political advantage. So why should Republicans play by rules the other side has no intention of honoring? It's a persuasive argument, especially to people who feel like they've been losing the culture war for decades while trying to be principled. But it's also dangerous, because once you start dismantling institutional safeguards, you can't put them back. The genie doesn't go back in the bottle. Treasury officials and key advisors have weighed in, many supporting the move. They argue that America is in a crisis, a border crisis, a fiscal crisis, a cultural crisis, and that crises require decisive action, not endless deliberation. They point to the backlog in immigration courts, the paralysis in Congress, the refusal of states to comply with federal law. How do you fix a broken system if the system itself prevents you from fixing it? Others, including some constitutional scholars who lean conservative, warn that this path leads to authoritarianism. Not because Trump is a dictator, but because the precedents being set will outlast any single president. You might trust Trump with expanded executive power, but do you trust the next president? And the one after that? These are hard questions, and there are no easy answers. What's clear is that Trump is pushing the boundaries of executive authority in ways we haven't seen in modern times, and he's doing it systematically across multiple fronts. Which brings us to his most eyebrow-raising move yet. In a press conference that caught even his own aides off guard, Trump confirmed that the administration is considering airstrikes on land in Venezuela. Not just intercepting drug boats at sea, which has been happening for months, but actual strikes inside Venezuelan territory, targeting cartel infrastructure, manufacturing facilities, and smuggling routes. The legal justification, Article 2 of the Constitution, which designates the president as commander-in-chief and grants him authority to respond to imminent threats. The administration argues that the drug crisis, which claims hundreds of thousands of American lives, constitutes an imminent threat. Therefore, striking at the source is a defensive measure, not an act of war. Critics immediately pushed back. Senator Chuck Schumer and others invoked the War Powers Act, which requires congressional authorization for prolonged military action. They argued that bombing another country, even one run by a hostile regime, is definitionally an act of war. If Trump proceeds without congressional approval, they warned, it would be an unconstitutional overreach. Here's where history provides some context. American presidents have authorized airstrikes and limited military operations without congressional approval many times. Barack Obama did it in Libya, in Syria, in Yemen. Trump himself did it during his first term against Iranian targets. George W. Bush did it repeatedly after 9/11. So the precedent for executive military action is well established. But land strikes inside a sovereign nation, even a failing narco state like Venezuela, take it to another level. and the optics are problematic. It's one thing to intercept boats in international waters. It's quite another to bomb targets inside another country's borders. That's the kind of thing that can escalate quickly, drawing in regional powers and creating diplomatic nightmares. Trump's defenders argue that Venezuela under Maduro is barely a functioning state, that it's essentially a cartel with a flag, and that treating it with diplomatic courtesy while it poisons Americans is absurd. His critics argue that unilateral military action, without congressional debate or international coalition building, sets a dangerous precedent. But while foreign policy grabbed headlines, something else was happening inside federal agencies that might have even longer-lasting consequences. Remember Jack Smith, the special counsel who spent over a year investigating Trump on charges related to January 6th and classified documents? Well, Congress just subpoenaed him. They want him to testify, under oath, about how he was appointed, who authorized his investigation, and whether the entire special counsel operation was constitutional in the first place. Here's why that matters. There's a growing legal argument, supported by some prominent judges and constitutional scholars, that special counsels like Jack Smith aren't actually constitutional. The theory goes like this. The Constitution allows Congress to create federal offices, and it allows the President to appoint officers to fill those positions with Senate confirmation. But special counsels are appointed by the Attorney General, not the President, and they aren't confirmed by anyone. They're essentially shadow officials with enormous power and zero accountability. A federal judge in Florida actually dismissed one of Smith's cases on exactly these grounds, ruling that his appointment was unconstitutional. The decision was controversial and likely to be appealed, but it opened a door, and now Congress wants to walk through it. If they can prove that Smith's appointment was invalid from the start, then everything he did, every subpoena, every indictment, every interview becomes fruit of the poisoned tree, legally worthless. More than that, it would call into question the entire special counsel system, which has been used repeatedly over the past few decades to investigate presidents from both parties. Now, why does this fit into the broader story we've been telling today? Because it's all about control. Control over who investigates whom. Control over whether political opponents can weaponize the justice system. Control over the levers of accountability. Jack Smith, whatever you think of his integrity, was part of a system that allows unelected officials to wield immense power with very little oversight. Trump's team is systematically dismantling that system, piece by piece. And that brings us to the most important insight of all, the one that ties everything together. If you've been following along, you might be thinking, this is a lot. Judges, welfare fraud, data battles, military strikes, special counsels, how does it all connect? Well, here's the thread. Trump's strategy rests on three pillars: courts, data, and enforcement. Courts decide who stays and who goes. If immigration judges are slow, lenient, or ideologically opposed to deportation, the system clogs. But if you replace them with judges who prioritize speed and enforcement, cases move faster, deportations increase, the backlog shrinks. Data reveals fraud. If states refuse to hand over records, fraud stays hidden. But if you force compliance, you can cross-reference databases, catch double-dippers, identify non-citizens illegally enrolled in programs, and root out waste. Data is power. Enforcement applies the law. It doesn't matter how good your judges are or how clean your data is if you don't have the will to enforce consequences. That means ICE raids. That means prosecution. That means withholding funds from non-compliant states. And yes, that might even mean military action against foreign cartels. Trump's moves over the past few weeks have targeted all three pillars simultaneously. He fired judges and hired enforcers. He demanded data and punished states that refused. He ramped up deportations, fraud prosecutions, and even military operations. It's not chaos. It's coordination. And that's why this moment is so significant. We're not just talking about policy tweaks or executive orders that the next administration will reverse. We're talking about structural changes to how the federal government operates. Changes that will define immigration, welfare, and executive power for decades. Will it work? That depends on how you define success. If the goal is faster deportations, less fraud, and a stronger executive branch, then probably yes. If the goal is maintaining institutional checks, protecting vulnerable populations, and preserving diplomatic norms, then probably no. Most likely, the truth will land somewhere in between. Courts will move faster, but some of the new judges will prove just as fallible as the old ones. Fraud will decrease, but aggressive data collection will create new privacy concerns and chill legitimate benefit use. Enforcement will tighten, but it will also generate stories of families separated and lives disrupted. So what does all of this tell us? In the span of just a few weeks, Trump fired over 100 immigration judges and replaced them with enforcement-focused appointees. He pressured more than 20 states to release detailed welfare data, threatening to freeze funding if they refused. He called out massive fraud in programs ranging from SNAP to Social Security, with particular focus on immigrant communities in Minnesota. He pushed for the elimination of the filibuster to ram through reforms that Congress won't pass. He confirmed military operations inside a foreign country without congressional authorization. And he set in motion an investigation into whether the special counsel who prosecuted him was ever legally appointed in the first place. Whether you agree with every move or not, one thing is undeniable. This is the largest, most coordinated restructuring of executive power we've seen in modern American politics. It touches everything: the courts, the borders, welfare programs, foreign policy, and federal oversight. And it's happening at a speed that leaves even seasoned political observers struggling to keep up. For Americans who remember a time when government moved slowly, when changes took years of debate and compromise, this might feel disorienting. But for millions of Americans who've watched the system fail for decades, who've seen borders ignored, fraud tolerated, and accountability vanished, this feels like something else. It feels like a reckoning. And here's the reality. Whether this reshaping strengthens America or shakes it to its core won't be clear for years, maybe decades. We're living through history right now, and history doesn't come with clear labels. It's messy, complicated, and full of unintended consequences. What we can do is stay informed, ask hard questions, demand accountability from all sides, and remember that in a republic, power is only as legitimate as the consent of the governed. That's us. That's you. If you want to stay ahead of these historic power shifts and understand what Trump's executive actions really mean for American families, make sure you like this video, subscribe, and leave a comment sharing whether you think these changes will strengthen the system or shake Washington to its core. Your voice matters now more than ever. Because at the end of the day, this isn't just about Trump. It's about the kind of country we're building for our children and grandchildren. A country where laws are enforced fairly, where fraud is punished, where borders mean something, or a country where executive power runs unchecked, where oversight is dismantled, and where the pendulum swings so far in one direction that the next swing back becomes inevitable and potentially catastrophic. Only time will tell. But one thing's for certain, we're not in Kansas anymore.